Jewish communities in Sydney are ramping up security measures as they face a surge in anti-Semitic attacks. This is the headline from the Daily Mail. Australian Jews up security, conceal identity amid stream of anti-Semitic attacks. Police and private security now present at Jewish schools, ensuring the safety of students returning after the summer break. Now, recent incidents include graffiti, several locations, and also a thwarted explosives attack, heightening fears within the community. I can't believe that this is happening in Australia.
Yeah, how did it come to this? Certainly the Australia that I know and grew up in was an Australia that was insulated from a lot of the problems around the world. Well,
how did we get here, right? How did we end up with thousands of pro-Palestinians marching in cities? Last year we watched the protests against Israel and the destruction that we saw in Gaza happening at universities across Australia. People were being kicked off grounds if they were protesting against the protesters, while we saw too. What are your views on what has happened? How did we get to this stage?
Politically, things have changed a bit, and there are certain, I guess, extremes of politics I guess it's flowing onto the streets. What I mean by that is there have been for years concerns about the so-called extreme right, your kind of more traditional anti-Semitic protesters, neo-Nazis, that kind of thing. But what we've seen on the other side of politics is, I guess, a legitimisation of anti-Semitism there as well. Now, a lot of the people marching on the streets every Sunday here in Melbourne, they are, expressing a view about the current situation in the Middle East. And they are legitimate concerns to raise. But the problem is there is a more extreme end, I would say the extreme left, who are prepared to I guess, basically engage in very sort of violent in terms of language and actions.
Well, we've seen that, right? We've seen cars that have been spray painted with F the Jews. We've seen buildings as well. It seems to be happening more regularly in both Melbourne and Sydney too. We've also seen that you talk about the idea of a legitimate protest. The challenge is that anti-Zionism can easily become anti-Semitism. And then we've got this really strange thing I've been noticing on the news, which is the pro-Palestinian marchers who are anti-Jewish, or at least anti-actions of Benjamin Netanyahu, who are then being confronted by neo-Nazis who now seem to be sticking up for the Jews. It's the most bizarre situation I've ever seen.
Yeah, look, it's a very confusing mix and something like we haven't really seen before. But I think let's go back to October 2023, and we saw almost instantly, before Israel actually had retaliated against what occurred. We saw what happened on the steps of the Sydney Opera House. We saw what happened in the streets of Lakemba in Sydney.
Well, I mean, they were chanting "Gas the Jews."
Yeah, well, I guess, or whatever it was, that has been sort of somewhat disputed by the police.
Well, there have been a few people who have said, eyewitnesses who were there, that's what they heard.
Well, I actually think the actual words are actually quite irrelevant. It was an extremely menacing scene that should not be occurring in this country. But what we have is a government, a national Australian government, that for 12 months or so has been insipidly weak. They've got the Greens on one side snapping at their heels, and on the other side they have certain voting blocks in Western Sydney
and Western Melbourne.
And yes, and that has really hamstrung the government in terms of its response.
That's quite frightening. If you think about John Howard and that famous moment after Port Arthur, where he stood up against, he was new into power, and he stood up against his own coalition partners, voters being Nationals, by banning guns, by banning these weapons. And he stood there famously in his flak jack, which I think he regrets ever wearing, but he did what was right for the country, bad perhaps for politics, but the rest of the country supported him. And there does seem to be this overarching view within Australians, they don't like drama. Let's talk about the caravan, the explosive caravan that was detected by accident, and this breakdown in communication between the New South Wales Premier's office, we understand, as well as the Prime Minister's office, the role of police and the federal police. What do we know?
Well, it appears that the New South Wales Police informed the Premier pretty promptly of what occurred, and certainly in my experience of working in the office of the New South Wales Premier, there's pretty much a hotline between those two offices. So things went as planned there. But in terms of why the Prime Minister was not informed of this, I'm kind of not so sure. Yes, that would have been a matter for the federal police to inform the Prime Minister's office of that, or at the very least the responsible minister. But also subsequent, even putting aside the federal police, there was a national cabinet meeting after this news became. This news was out there. It wasn't mentioned there. The New South Wales Premier met the Prime Minister, and it wasn't mentioned during that discussion. It kind of makes no sense, but it really does speak to this broader issue of I guess the leadership style of Anthony Albanese and the command he has over the job.
Let's have a listen to the opposition leader Peter Dutton speaking about this.
If the Prime Minister of our country is not across what was potentially the biggest terrorist attack in our country's history, essentially until the public found out about it, I think that is an absolute abrogation of his responsibility.
Now, we compare this to Donald Trump, who came out very forcefully, we were just talking about that before, following this plane crash in DC. And yet the Australian Prime Minister finding out, along with everybody else, something which really, I mean, we expect that there are conversations happening all the time. We've heard some suggestions that there was a fear that it would become political if the AFP was to let the Prime Minister's office know. That's terrifying in itself.
Yeah, fear of it becoming political. Well, hello, where are we now? So this is just...
But why are they fearing that? Why are they fearing a political conversation about a group of people putting together explosives in a caravan and having a list of Jewish targets? That is politics.
Oh, yeah, well, exactly. It's totally unfathomable why the federal police didn't inform the Prime Minister's office, unless there has been I guess, a request from the Prime Minister's office that they are not informed of operational matters like this.
Plausible deniability.
Well, exactly. That's really concerning. I mean, are you the leader of this country or not?
All right.